What happens when you mistake quiet grace for weakness and discover too late who she really is? It was just past midnight when Evelyn Hartley pulled her modest silver SUV into the quiet streets of Fairfax, Virginia. The world outside was draped in silence. Only the occasional hum of streetlights and distant crickets interrupted the peace. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her hands steady, her breath calm. She had done this drive dozens of times before, and tonight it was supposed to be no different. At 29, Evelyn led a life that many might overlook. With her chestnut brown hair tied into a loose braid, dressed in jeans, a gray windbreaker, and scuffed white sneakers, she could pass for a schoolteacher or a nurse. Kind, soft-spoken, unassuming. But what no one knew, what she had spent the better part of a decade ensuring no one would know, was that she wasn't just Evelyn Hartley from Mount Rainier. She was Agent Evelyn Hartley of the Central Intelligence Agency, operating under deep cover. This assignment had taken her into the underbelly of a small-town conspiracy. For months, she had gathered intelligence on internal corruption, buried deep within Fairfax's local institutions. Tonight was supposed to be her last night in town. Her mission was complete. The flash drive tucked away in her backpack held everything: audio, surveillance footage, and encrypted documents. Her report was scheduled to be sent at dawn. But then came the sirens. The blinding red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, painting her face in pulses of warning. The sound, sharp, intentional, unmistakable, broke the serenity of the night. Evelyn's heart did not race. Her instincts didn't scream. Instead, everything inside her clicked into focus. She eased the car to the side of the road, switched off the engine, and reached calmly for her license and registration. In the side mirror, she caught the two officers emerging from the patrol car behind her. Both white, both confident, both walking with a heavy boot swagger that said this wasn't their first time pulling someone over in the middle of the night. The taller one had a buzz cut and a smug expression already forming. The other, shorter and bulkier, had a baton in one hand, tapping it against his thigh. She knew the drill, but what she didn't know yet was that they weren't looking to write her a ticket. They were looking to make an example of her, one that would never reach the morning light. Evelyn rolled down her window halfway, enough to show respect, but not enough to surrender control. The taller officer leaned in, shining his flashlight directly into her face. The beam danced across her cheek, catching the light sheen on her brow and the faint scar above her temple, an old injury from a past mission no one here would ever understand. "Evening, ma'am," the officer drawled, lips curling into a forced grin. His badge read, Carter. "Know why we stopped you tonight?" "No, officer," Evelyn answered evenly. "I obeyed the traffic signs. There was no one else at the intersection." Carter snorted softly. "That's cute," he said. "Except you rolled through a stop sign. Happens more than you think." "I came to a full stop," she said, not aggressively, just as a fact. The second officer stepped in now, Sullivan, according to his badge. He circled the car like a wolf sizing up its prey, flashlight sweeping across the back seat, over the trunk, and lingering suspiciously on her backpack. "You live around here?" Carter asked, inspecting her ID as though he couldn't believe someone like her belonged in this neighborhood. "Yes, 4 blocks over. I just left a 7-Eleven. Sullivan knocked on the trunk lightly, then called out, "Carter, mind taking a look at this?" Evelyn turned slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The two officers walked toward the back of the SUV. She couldn't see their faces, only the low murmur of their voices and the rhythmic squeak of a zipper. Then, "Well, would you look at that?" Sullivan said loudly, feigning surprise. "She's got herself a party pack." Carter's footsteps crunched back toward her window. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Evelyn's brows knit just slightly. "What's going on?" "There's what appears to be a bag of cocaine in your trunk," Carter replied, voice flat and official. "That's impossible," she said, cool but alert now. "There was nothing there." "Then I'm sure you'll have no problem letting us check." Sullivan stood behind Carter now, arms folded, watching with a smirk like he'd seen this play out before. Evelyn knew this was more than just a bad stop. This was premeditated. "Please step out of the vehicle," Carter repeated. "Hands where I can see 'em." She did, slowly, deliberately. She didn't resist, didn't argue. She wasn't here to win this fight on the side of the road. The real battleground would come later. The cuffs were tight, intentionally so. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady, her eyes cold steel. "We'll see about that," Sullivan muttered, pushing her toward the back seat of the patrol car with a little more force than necessary. As they drove her to the station, Evelyn stared out the window, silent, but her mind was roaring. They had no idea what they had just triggered. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Evelyn was led into the Arlington County precinct, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper, burnt coffee, and something colder. Authority turned sour. Her boots squeaked slightly on the linoleum floor, still wet from melting snow tracked in by the night shift. She walked calmly, hands cuffed behind her back, chin held high despite the curious stares from officers lounging behind their desks. "We got a live one tonight," Officer Carter announced with an air of smug performance, caught her running stop signs and hauling a powder prize. Sullivan dropped the zip-sealed bag on the booking desk like a trophy. "Guess she thought the suburbs were a safe place to move weight." Evelyn said nothing. She studied the room, noting the placement of cameras, the exit signs, the layout of desks and lockers. Everything. The young officer at the booking computer, badge-reading Keller, looked up at her with a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion? Guilt? It passed quickly. "Name?" he asked, voice uncertain. "Evelyn Grace Morgan." "Occupation?" She hesitated. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to suggest the kind of pause any innocent woman would take after being wrongly accused. "Nonprofit consultant," she answered, truth wrapped in misdirection. "Environmental impact." Carter leaned against the desk with a scoff. "Yeah, she consults for the Colombian snow industry." Laughter rippled through the room, but Keller didn't join in. They took her fingerprints, took her photograph. The camera's flash burst against the gray wall like a slap. Then they marched her down a narrow hallway to a holding cell. Small, cold, sterile. The steel door clanged shut behind her like a promise. Inside the cell, Evelyn sat down on the bench without a sound. Her breathing slowed, her posture straightened. She wasn't in panic. She was in observation mode. It was all so methodical, so familiar. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan poured themselves stale coffee from the pot that had probably been sitting since sundown. "Did you see her face?" Carter said, chuckling into his mug. "Didn't flinch. These types always think they can stare their way out of it." "Or lawyer up fast," Sullivan added, "but with what we found, open and shut." He tapped his phone screen, then laughed again. "God, I love when they try to act innocent. Bet she's got no one to call. No one's coming for her." Keller walked past, his hands stiff at his sides. He didn't look at either of them. He had seen the woman's face, too. But not fear and not guilt. Just stillness. A strange kind of readiness. Back in her cell, Evelyn tilted her head upward toward the grimy camera in the corner. She'd already counted the screws holding the vent plate above the door. She'd already noted the officer rotations, the pattern of footsteps, the hours between check-ins. Her jacket cuff pressed softly against her thigh. Within the seam was something small, silent, and signal-capable. She shifted her wrist just enough, pressing a pressure point in the fabric that triggered a microbeacon. It blinked once, then again. Invisible to the eye, untraceable to anyone who wasn't looking. They would know where she was within 5 minutes. "Hey, Keller," Carter's voice rang out from the break room. "What's with the long face? You act like we shot your dog." Keller said nothing. He sat at his desk, fingers hovering above his keyboard. He opened the case file again. It was too clean. Pulled over at midnight, claimed she blew a stop sign, but the intersection wasn't even marked properly, claimed she gave consent, but no dash cam footage to confirm it. And the drugs? Sitting at the top of her trunk, not hidden, just waiting. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, his gut twisted. People like Carter and Sullivan didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote them. An hour passed. Another. Evelyn never asked for a phone call, never knocked on the door, never raised her voice. She just waited. Exactly the kind of behavior that made men like Carter nervous. He glanced at the hallway monitor every few minutes, checked the camera feed for her cell. "She's still just sitting there," he muttered to Sullivan. "Good," Sullivan said. "She'll stew long enough, she'll break." But she wasn't stewing. She was timing. She was remembering. And she was quietly preparing. Meanwhile, at a black site 2 hours outside D.C., a small terminal lit up. Tracking signal received. 2 agents stood. "She's been compromised," one said flatly. The other nodded. "We extract Now, at the Arlington precinct, the clock struck 4:17 a.m. Carter leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head. Let her sweat. Judge won't see her till late afternoon anyway. Sullivan tossed a paper ball into the trash. Gives us time to tidy the narrative. But in cell 3, Evelyn Morgan, age 29, nonprofit consultant and ghost-class CIA operative, closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to listen. To the station. To her heartbeat. To the countdown that had already begun. Morning crept into Arlington with the color of cold steel, pale, silent, uncertain. Snowmelt trickled past the curbs, and a soft wind carried the scent of yesterday's rain and something else, reckoning. Inside the precinct, Officer James Keller stared at his computer monitor, the cursor blinking in rhythm with his rising unease. His coffee had long gone cold, and so had his excuses. He had read the report 3 times now. Carter's phrasing was too perfect. The words nervous behavior, visible agitation, consent granted were all copy-pasted from every other case he'd seen that went sideways. Except something about this one was different. The woman wasn't nervous. She hadn't even flinched, and that bag, it had practically presented itself like a bad stage prop. Keller opened the internal arrest database. His fingers hovered, then typed Carter plus Sullivan. Dozens of reports populated the screen. Different names, different dates, same patterns, minor traffic stop, claimed consent, discovered contraband, every single one. Almost all were people of color. Almost all pled out. He felt his stomach clench. These weren't isolated mistakes. This was a method. Down the hallway, Evelyn sat motionless on the edge of the metal bench. She had counted every second, every door creak, every footstep. When she heard Keller's pass near her cell again, slower this time, she spoke. You saw it, didn't you? Keller stopped mid-step. Her voice was low but clear. You saw the report, she continued. You noticed how it reads like a template. He didn't respond. I'm not asking you to be a hero, she said, her gaze steady. I'm asking you to stop pretending. He turned, visibly shaken. You don't understand how it works here. Evelyn's expression softened, but only slightly. I understand it better than you think. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan were laughing over donuts, the morning news playing behind them. The anchor mentioned a corruption probe in another county. Carter rolled his eyes. Always the bad apples story, he muttered, as if the whole tree ain't rotting. Sullivan laughed through a mouthful of sugar. You think Keller's buying the act? Doesn't matter, Carter said. He's a rookie. Rookies get scared, not brave. Keller sat at his desk, breathing hard. He minimized the arrest files, opened the precinct's camera system instead, located the timestamp, played back the footage from the cell corridor, paused, zoomed. There, a shadow, Evelyn's hand, pressing briefly into her jacket seam, barely perceptible. She hadn't just been sitting still. She'd been sending a signal. Keller swallowed hard. He clicked open her intake form again. There was a gap in her employment history. No social media footprint for the past 2 years. No forwarding address on her voter file. That wasn't just weird. That was intentional. He stood, slowly, then walked. Evelyn heard the door unlock. Keller stood there, holding a paper coffee cup. He pushed it through the slot. She accepted it silently, her eyes never leaving his. Why are you helping me? He asked, voice low. I'm not asking you to, she replied. I'm asking you to do what you already know is right. Keller exhaled shakily. If I speak up, Carter Sullivan, they'll bury me. Evelyn's tone was softer now, but sharper too. Then don't speak, act. Across town, in a secure FBI operations van, the signal Evelyn had triggered pulsed steadily on a monitor. A team leader leaned over it, nodding once. She's in position. One agent glanced at his watch. Extraction window? 10 minutes. The van's doors swung open. Suits moved like clockwork. Back at the station, Keller stood frozen before the evidence room. His access card trembled slightly in his hand. He knew what he was about to do. He was about to check the chain of custody log. And if what he feared was true, if Carter and Sullivan had slipped the bag into the system before the stop was filed, the whole case would unravel. He scanned his badge. The door clicked. Inside the sterile room, rows of evidence lockers lined the walls. He typed in the case number from Evelyn's file. Judgment A0003241. Logged by Officer Sullivan. Time, 11:42 p.m. Date, 10 minutes before the traffic stop was initiated. Keller froze. That was it. The lie, documented, in the system. He printed the log, folded it, tucked it into his vest, and walked out of the room with a fire in his chest. As he passed by Evelyn's cell again, she looked up. He didn't say anything, but he nodded, just once. And in that moment, Evelyn knew. The wall had cracked. Justice always started with one small rupture, one whisper of truth loud enough to shake a building. And now, that whisper had begun. It started with a whisper. Then came the silence. Then came the storm. At precisely 9:47 a.m., the front doors of the Arlington Police Department opened, not with a bang, but with a quiet authority that somehow spoke louder than sirens. 3 agents entered, black suits, straight backs, no hesitation. The lead man, tall, silver at the temples, carried a leather folder under one arm. His badge gleamed, but he didn't flash it. He didn't have to. "Agent Price, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said calmly to the front desk sergeant. "We're here on a matter of internal misconduct. We'll require access to your surveillance feeds, records, and holding cells." The sergeant blinked. Do you have a warrant?" Price didn't flinch. "We don't need one. We have probable cause." The air changed. Officers looked up from their desks. Coffee mugs paused midair. Whispers began. And inside his office, Carter looked up from a stack of falsified reports and felt something cold slide down his spine. Keller sat frozen at his terminal as the agents walked past. He saw the folder Agent Price was carrying, and though he couldn't read the label, he knew what it was. The truth. He rose, throat dry, and made his way toward the holding cells, just in time to see the second agent approach Evelyn's cell. "Miss Carter," the agent said, unlocking the door with a swift motion, "you're free to go." Evelyn stood with grace, not surprise. She gave Keller one long look, not of triumph, but of quiet recognition. Then turned, stepped into the hallway, and didn't look back. Carter stood in the middle of the briefing room, talking to Sullivan in clipped tones. "Though we stick to the story," she consented. "We followed protocol. We logged the evidence." "Carter," Sullivan said, his voice suddenly dry, "they're here." Carter turned and saw Agent Price standing in the doorway, calm as a loaded gun. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan," Price said evenly. "You'll need to come with us." "For what?" Carter scoffed, trying to summon his usual bravado. "You're not even—" "Now," Price interrupted. 2 agents flanked them before either man could speak again. Around them, silence fell. Officers stared. No one moved. It was the silence of scales tipping, the sound of an empire starting to collapse. In a closed interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat across from Agent Price. Their uniforms, usually crisp and commanding, now looked like costumes clinging to the last breath of authority. "Let's start with the traffic stop," Price said, opening the folder, specifically the one involving Miss Evelyn Carter. "We followed procedure," Carter said flatly. "She failed to stop. We requested consent." Price slid a document across the table. It was the chain of custody log. "Logged at 11:42 p.m., he said. 10 minutes before you pulled her over." Sullivan flinched. Carter's jaw tightened. "That could be a mistake," Carter muttered. "Then explain this," Price replied, pressing a button. Audio played from a tiny speaker in the corner. It was Sullivan's voice. "It'll look like she had it the whole time. We toss it in the trunk, log it before we write her up, and she's finished." Then Carter's voice. "She fits the type, quiet, nobody will ask questions." Silence followed, the kind that suffocates. "You were recorded," Price said simply. "Every word, every lie." Back at the bullpen, Keller stood at his desk, watching the live feed from the interrogation room. Around him, officers whispered in disbelief, some stepping away from their computers, some sitting still with frozen expressions. He barely noticed Evelyn stepping up beside him. "Are they cracking?" she asked softly. He nodded. "They're done." Evelyn glanced at the screen. Carter looked pale. Sullivan had his head in his hands. "They never saw this coming," Keller said. "No," Evelyn replied. "They never thought anyone would hold them accountable." As the agents escorted Carter and Sullivan through the main hall in handcuffs, the station went still. It wasn't outrage that filled the room. It was relief. One officer leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Another quietly muttered, "Finally." The chief, watching from his office, turned away and drew the blinds. But the truth was already out in the light. And light doesn't ask permission to shine. Evelyn stood by the exit now, looking at the glass doors, her back to the station. Keller approached, a nervous energy clinging to him. "I wasn't sure you'd get out." "You helped," she said. "That made all the difference." He lowered his voice. "So, you really are." She gave a small smile. "I told you, I'm a consultant." He grinned, then sobered. "What happens now?" Evelyn looked through the glass as the FBI van pulled away with Carter and Sullivan inside. "Now," she said, "now we clean up." The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows. Officers from other precincts filled the benches, some watching in stunned silence, others barely meeting anyone's gaze. The judge adjusted her robe and scanned the room with cool, precise authority. But all eyes were on the woman in the front row, the one in a plain navy blouse and a soft wool skirt, her hair pulled back simply, her face calm. Evelyn Carter, the woman they tried to erase. Not a criminal, not a victim, but something far more dangerous to injustice. A witness who remembered everything. The prosecution moved swiftly. Evidence piled high. Audio recordings, surveillance footage, fingerprint discrepancies, chain of custody mismatches, testimony after testimony, including one from Officer Keller, who stepped onto the stand with trembling hands but steady conviction. "They lied," he said, "and I let it happen until I couldn't anymore." In the back, Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not out of pain, but out of peace. Carter tried to speak. His lawyers urged him not to. But pride dies hard. "They're making me a scapegoat," he argued. "It's her word against ours. She manipulated the system." Then Agent Price stood, and without raising his voice, he played the last piece of audio from Evelyn's hidden device. Carter's voice just before the arrest. "She won't fight it. Women like her never do. Quiet face, no backup, no power. We own this street." A stunned hush fell, and then the courtroom shifted, from suspicion to outrage. The judge's ruling was firm. "Officers Carter and Sullivan," she said, her voice echoing with finality, "you are found guilty on multiple counts, including evidence tampering, falsifying arrest records, and abuse of power under color of law. You will serve time. And this court strongly recommends federal investigation into all prior cases under your command." Carter slumped. Sullivan wept. Outside the courthouse, the sky broke open into gentle spring sunlight. No crowds cheered. No camera flashes lit the air. Just quiet. Evelyn stepped onto the courthouse steps. Agent Price approached her. "You could have gone public," he said, taken the credit, even joined the bureau. Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't do this for credit. I did it so it wouldn't happen to the next woman who wears what I wear, who drives where I drive, who says nothing, and gets crushed for it." "You're not just a field agent," he said. "You're a damn story." She smiled faintly. "No, I'm just a woman who knew the truth, and refused to let it die in a holding cell." Weeks later, Evelyn returned to her modest apartment on the edge of town. The case had made headlines, not with her name, but with the system it exposed. Dozens of convictions were reopened. Officers were reevaluated. Reforms were passed. And Evelyn? She stayed out of the spotlight. But on her kitchen table sat a letter, handwritten. "I resigned today," it read. "But not because I gave up. Because I'm joining something better. A team that sees people, not power. Thank you for showing me what that looks like." It was signed, Officer James Keller. Evelyn folded the letter, placed it in a small tin box, and tucked it in her drawer beside a well-worn map, marked for the next mission. Then she picked up her duffel bag, stepped into the morning air, and disappeared down the street, like the wind before the storm. In a world where appearances are judged faster than truth is heard, one woman stood still and let the truth speak for itself. She didn't wear a cape. She didn't raise her voice. She simply refused to be silenced. A simple woman, framed, underestimated, and nearly erased, became the symbol of a justice that didn't roar, but whispered its way into history. Have you ever been judged by what you wear or how you look? Or have you ever stood up for someone, even when it cost you comfort? Share your story in the comments, because every truth matters. And if this story moved you, if you believe in quiet strength, dignity, and the power of not looking away, then like, share, and subscribe. Because the next woman like Evelyn, she might be walking into the storm tomorrow,